Welcome back to the DemystifySci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
On this podcast, we explore the theories that we think are going to change the world. And today, we have a theory about how it is that humans became human. This is an open question that we have touched upon on this show in multiple different conversations. We've had linguists, we've had anthropologists, we've had archaeologists, and today we have Andrew Cutler, who is technically an electrical engineer by training, an AI programmer by day, and author of the Substack called Vectors of Mind by night, where he has been slowly piecing together a story of human origins that is pretty radical, and it has to do with a matriarchal primordial society, the effect of snake venom as a transcendent entheogen, and the diffusion of this cultural memeplex throughout the world over the course of just a few thousand years.
And the real central question here, which plagues linguists and philosophers and all of us, is what separates a human being from the rest of the animals in the zoo? This coming into self-awareness, this birth of recursive thought. How did this happen and how was it transmitted? Did it occur all at once? Did it diffuse from one place? Was it something everybody sort of stumbled into all together? And what's its relationship to other abstractions like art and symbology? So awesome conversation about an absolutely impossible question to answer at the end of the day. So I love just hearing new theories about how this came.
And much of the difficulty of answering this question is centered around something that archaeologists call the Sapient paradox, which is that genetically modern humans emerge 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. But the cultural artifacts that make us modern humans don't seem to arise until about 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. And this massive takeover of a unified culture of sorts doesn't seem to happen until even later than that, like 15 to 10,000 years ago. And so Andrew's attempting to reconstruct what social technologies were able to make this happen, where it happened, and how it got diffused throughout the entire world. And he's operating under a different frame than is the most popular frame, which you've probably heard of the stoned ape theory, which says that humans began to eat magic mushrooms and they exposed their minds to something that's much larger than this terrestrial three-dimensional world. They suddenly learned abstract thinking. And Andrew's like, hey, hold on, let's wait a second. The foundational myth of humankind is not a myth of the mushroom eaters. The foundational myth of humankind is the serpent and the woman.
Remember, guys, the podcast is entirely supported by listeners like you, and that means we work directly for you. So if you want to support this work, come over and check out our Patreon page. It's patreon.com/demystifysci. For just a couple dollars a month, you can come and hang out with us face to face, and you can sleep better knowing that you're supporting something that doesn't need to invoke advertisements or sell things that we don't care about. And we'll make this continue to be a better and better project together. So I'd love to see you over there. You can also come and hang out with us in person this summer at our second annual conference. It's part of the Demysticon project. I recommend you go over and check out DemystifySci.com to learn more about that. But essentially, we're bringing together a historic group of cosmologists to discuss the future of that science because there is an obvious and incredible paradigm shift underway in that science, and it's a fantastic opportunity to take part in history as it's being made.
There's a history of scientific moments like this. Like, there are the first lectures at the Royal Society, there are the Solvay conferences. They're moments that you read about in books and you wonder, what would it have been like to have a front row seat to these discussions? And up until recently, that's kind of been relegated to the land of wishful thinking because those days are gone. The paradigms have entrenched themselves and nobody's holding these sorts of events anymore. And what we're doing this summer in Portugal is we're recreating a historical way of talking about science, which the world hasn't seen for probably 100 years. And so if you've ever sat around and been like, man, I wish I could have been there, come to Portugal. Join us for something that will be truly historic, because whatever else happens, you will not regret having been there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So check it out. It's over at DemystifySci.com. See what's going on. I would love to see you there and meet you and hear your ideas and get you included in the conversation in whatever capacity you're able to. Otherwise, enjoy this conversation about the origins of behaviorally modern humans with Andrew Cutler.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify podcast.
Want to see in the dark?
This is kind of the way that you structure your blog posts too, which is you're basically like, look, there's this question that people have been trying to figure out, which is like, what does it mean for humans to have developed this self-awareness? And how did that happen? And when did that happen? I think that the like underlying frame is this idea of the sapient paradox, right? Where we're like, well, humans have been around for 100,000 years, 200,000 years, but we think that the earliest vestiges of culture are only like 50,000 years old. Like, that's kind of weird. Like, why is that?
Yeah, so the in general, if you make a list of what makes humans human, so what makes Homo's sapient, um, it's things like art, language, religion. These are behaviors that humans have that it seems as though no animals have these behaviors. And so if you look back in the archaeological record, you see faint hints of these about 70,000 years ago. So there's some burials which hint at beliefs of an afterlife or beliefs that there's something other than just the material. There's also extremely primitive art. About 70,000 years ago, this is South Africa and Blombus Cave. But we don't get full-blown artistic expression until maybe 50 or especially 40,000 years ago in the Upper Paleolithic. And then still, all of that is extremely spotty until surprisingly like 12,000 years ago. And so this is going off the work of people like Colin Renfrew, who's an archaeologist. It's also this timeline I just suggested was the dominant timeline for a long time, up until like the 2000s. This idea that there was behavioral modernity, which started 50-ish thousand years ago, and then there was this new type of human who took over the world. And then the problem that gives us is if you look genetically, there are splits in between different groups going back probably like 200, 300,000 years ago. And so it's really it's one of the great open questions is why the behavior is so much after the genetic origins of Homo sapiens, as well as the anatomical origins of Homo sapiens with anatomical modernity about 200,000 years ago. And so it's just how did that happen? You can tell a pretty clean story before we had the genetic evidence that, oh, we found language, we evolved language somehow, and then took over the world. But then now we have these, it's harder because there are different groups have been separated for 200 or so thousand years. And so that really, really complicated the story for the last 20 years or so.
Aren't there a few people like, is it Chomsky and Pinker who think that a single mutation could account for all of this? Like just to sort of steelman this other perspective?
Yeah, so Chomsky tries to bring this question outside of evolution. So he doesn't think it was bit by bit. It's in general this is called a saltationist approach, where he and others have a very the most extreme view, where it was a single mutation. And the problem is they pointed to like the Fox P I think a P1 gene, but
Which is like a master regulator of some sort, from what I understand.
yeah, but if you look, so now they can do what's a genome-wide association study, and so they can take phenotypes from millions of different humans alive, as they also have their DNA, and they can do regression on all of these genes and see which genes are most important. And there's not one for something like educational attainment, so how many years you go to school, or IQ. There's not one gene that just leaps out. It's literally thousands of genes that affect this. And so it doesn't seem as though it was a single gene that did it. In fact, there's a really recent paper just a few months ago out of the Reich lab at Harvard. So he's a superstar in genetics. And they show that there's been extreme evolutionary selection pressure just in the last 10,000 years or so. The only place where we have enough samples to show that is in Eurasia. But if you look in the supplement, it's crazy that he calculated that just 9,000 years ago, the average IQ was like 65. This is the average genetic potential for IQ, which there's lots going on there that we could get into, but there's just from the molecular genetics side, we're getting quite strong evidence that there's been selection for IQ across many, many genes in the last 10,000 years. And then if you project that, okay, we've gained 35 IQ points in the past 10,000 years, then what about the last 50,000 years? And so if you just say a similar process has been going on for a long time, then it looks like, okay, we could have passed some sort of threshold in intelligence that made symbolic thought possible. And it probably wasn't just one gene, it was probably many, many genes that were implicated in this process.
And so why was it attempted to explain using a single mutational event? Is it because of the suddenness of the change in the archaeological record?
Chomsky wasn't the only one
Sure.
who, so other people would argue for multiple. It's preserving parts of the blank slate is part of it. It really does push language outside of evolution by making it a single random event that doesn't necessarily have to have been incrementally fit. That we just got full-blown language all at once.
And do people recognize that that's absurd, or is that
I think that
is that
most
a
people, I haven't
well-regarded
seen
theory?
anybody. It has Chomsky on it, so I think Chomsky has never. He's not one to back down. He has never said that that's absurd. But I haven't seen any geneticist take that claim seriously.
Well, can you say very explicitly why you think it's absurd?
Language is complex, and the idea that it emerged like that because of a mutation over the course of a single generation seems absolutely absurd to me, because the cognitive processes that you have to go from having the the symbol, the signal and the signifier, or whatever it is. I don't remember my my critical theory properly. But basically, it just seems insane to imagine that happening as a discrete process, as opposed to an iterative, needs-based approach that humans adopted as they needed to communicate progressively more and more complex ideas.
You also see proto-linguistic behavior in other animals, right? Like the cat wants food, and the cat makes it known to you that it wants food using some vocalization pattern that's different than when the cat wants even water or something, right?
Sure.
And so there is vocal expression of information, which might not be abstract in nature or infinitely recursive, but there's something happening.
Well, and whales and birdsong and all of these things that are not language, like you said, in their ability to convey complex liturgical concepts, maybe, but that they still have some kind of information being processed. And so you're like, okay, well, if that happens as background really widely, then it seems like there is a gradual process of honing that into a stronger and stronger tool that leads you to the place where humans are, as opposed to just an overnight switch.
Yeah, so I really think it must have been a slow gene culture interaction. And I also, one of the things I emphasize in my piece is that there was probably lot of downsides to language in the beginning. I mean, I point out that what if evolving recursion also gave a lot of the earlier people who were evolving it something like cluster headaches. Like imagine that there could have been trade-offs to this really overpowered new skill that we were evolving.
We're setting the stage where recursion is important. It is a thing that humans have. It is a thing that animals don't have, and we've put it at the center of the transition of humans into humans from something that is more animalistic that precedes it. And so, let's talk about that. Why is recursion so important? Why is it something that defines us in terms of separating us from the animals?
Well, so there's the best book I've read on this is The Recursive Mind by Michael Corballis. So he's a linguist as well as a psychologist, and so he explains how the general Chomsky model of recursion being the essential part of grammar for human language. And additionally, that recursion underlies things like mental time travel. And
Let's
so that
explain.
once
Let's explain recursion, though.
Okay, so you've had a few episodes on recursion, haven't you? I was listening to parts of your one of the difference between LLMs and language.
Yeah, for sure. But I doubt that a lot of people have listened to those, so it's probably worth laying out.
Yeah, like
one
I
more
think that
time.
this is a case.
That was a joke.
Yeah. So recursion is some process that can take its output as input. And so the prototypical example of language, you could say like Jack hit the ball, and then you could say like Sally saw Jack hit the ball, and then you could say like Joseph said Sally saw Jack hit the ball. So you can just infinitely add these different parts of language, or these additions that require parsing of everything before it for it to make sense. And it completely changes the meaning of the sentence with each of these additions. So that's recursion in language as Chomsky explains it. And then there's also, it seems that, so people like Terence Deacon will talk about how recursion is related to symbolic thought. So in symbolic thought, you have some pointer to some process that's at a different level of abstraction than its own. So he thinks that recursion is also related to symbolic thought. Mental time travel requires recursion. A couple other Corballis talks about is counting, as well as, of course, self-awareness. And it's interesting that you do get basically all of these at once about 50,000 years ago. So you get it's quite cool. The oldest known example of counting is 28 marks on a bone. This is like 50 or so thousand years ago in Africa. And it seems so it's 28. So maybe it was tracking a menstrual cycle, or tracking the cycle of a moon. But it does, so we get that right at about the time that we start getting art, so it's symbolic thought, and at about the same time we start getting burials. And conveniently, at the same time that humans take over the whole world. So it seems like we got this new tool and really drove all of the other members of the genus to extinction.
So, yeah, it seems to me that we can safely say abstraction and recursion are linked principles, because what's really interesting about humans is not only that we are able to make a primary abstraction on physical information. So like motion, something used to be over here and now it's over here, or it's moving, right? This is a really, really primary physical abstraction. But then we can take that abstraction and nest it into another layer, which is like, this motion is faster than this motion. And then you can keep going with this until you get into these wildly complex spaces where you are referring down to each level ultimately, but those early abstraction layers don't even matter to you at some point. Like, we have a friend who builds computers who's obsessed with this too, because people who work on the software couldn't care less about what the atoms are doing inside of their machines. It's just totally unimportant to them. But somebody else might be concerned with that particular level and so on and so forth. So there's something really, really tightly related about this recursive ability and our ability to function abstractly in these technological spaces that we've come to define our environment by, essentially.
And it seems like it is reasonable to say that that ability is what makes humans human. Like, we're tool-making monkeys, and so we have this ability to abstractly conceive of something that doesn't yet exist and then figure out how to pull together the resources necessary in order to bring that into existence.
Even if that's some
Well,
tool
the
like a
tools go back.
morality. Like, it could be a
Tools
tool.
go back
It could
like
be a
2
tool. It could be an
million years.
abstract
So-
tool like morality, though, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be like a hammer and chisel.
Yeah, like, I think that I guess tool isn't the right word here, because you're right that tool use goes back much, much farther. And so what would you call it then? Like, technology? Because this thing that, like, humans can do, which is language and morality and conscience, and is there a term that you
Software.
I mean, I think it's a whole structure of thought that only humans have access to. And so there's this whole class of thoughts which requires recursion to have. Even a word like therefore, right? These sort of connections, or anything with grammar, having the idea I am. So it's the self looking back at itself that defines the self. So all of these are a class of thought that only humans can have. And I agree with Corvallis. They're probably tightly intertwined. And I don't think that I am was the first recursive thought. I think that there was probably a mess of recursive thoughts, but then once I am came on the scene, or once self-reflection came on the scene, that it was such a game changer, that spread quite quickly throughout the world, and that really established the human condition.
And that moment when this self-awareness emerged, you think that was a discrete event. Is that what most people think, or do people seem to think that there's shades of gray in terms of self-awareness as well?
Do you
Yeah, so
think
I
that it was a
don't think it was a
discrete
discrete event, but I do think it was a discrete movement, and that's something that you might mythologize as an event later.
event? Okay, so
Um,
we get to bring in the mythological angle here, right? Because you're making this really detailed case where you're like, the mythology is telling us about something that happened to humans, which is so central that it is actually the story of us becoming whatever it is that we are.
yeah.
Do you want to lay out the broad strokes frame of that?
Yeah, so in the class of recursive thoughts, I think that I am was the most important, like realizing that, like being able to introspect. Um, I think because of social pressures, or evolutionary pressures to be socially adept, I think that women would have had that thought first. And a really interesting thing is that for the first, say, 30,000 years of art, if you tally up all of the images of humans, like 95% of those are women. And so archaeologists have kind of puzzled over that for a long, long time. It kind of came to a standstill, but it's extremely interesting. So I interpret that as, women were the first to experience I am, and they made art to reflect that.
Can I back you up just a tiny bit and unpack why you think that the I am moment was pivotal to the acceleration of progress for our species? I don't disagree. I'm just curious if you can unpack that.
Because it's it makes us who we are. So it's once you realize you are, so you are fully conscious, right? You would have been unconscious like an animal before that, and then once you realize I am, you are like you're a human. You're sapient.
Like I would could I maybe suggest that there's something about being able to behold yourself that allows you to improve yourself in terms of your immediate fitness in your social situations, in your physical situation. Like you can look at yourself and be like, hey, I could do better at whatever it is I'm doing, and actually shape the self for the first time. I wonder if that isn't the hinge.
Or even in a more
I
simple way, not necessarily immediately this aspect of like developing yourself, but maybe in the most rudimentary sense, the awareness that you are the actor, right? Because I think that this is because this is kind of the Janesian. Did you read Janes's bicameral mind?
yeah, I did.
Okay.
He actually gives a great example about this. So, which is a little bit disagreeing with you. So you're saying it could have been like the positive side that we could have improved ourselves.
I'm trying to
One of the
understand the basic, like what lever of fitness it gives you. I don't know if that's the right word. Some evolutionary biologist is going to like completely flip out. But what advantage does that bestow on the individual that leads to this rapid acceleration of the species in this direction? Like,
I think you become the main character. Like instead of being somebody who is subject to the whims of gods, now you are suddenly the one who is creating the words that before felt like they came from God. And now they come from you. You are the actor. You are the one who is doing things as opposed to the world happening to you. That's
So James gives a great example of so chimps can do deception, but they can't really lie. So they can't do anything very elaborate. And so you can imagine the first people who think internally like, oh, I'm going to express something that I don't believe. Like I'm not going to wear my heart on my sleeve to get some, like to accomplish some task. So that's it wasn't. You could also self-awareness also helps you imagine the future. So once you have this recursive eye, you can imagine the future. So you can imagine, hey, we're going to plant seeds now, and then we actually don't have to follow the herds of beasts because this is going to grow, and we can be sedentary.
or you can put the beasts, you can corral them into a corner with a bunch of rocks so you don't have to chase them around all the time. I mean, chickens, whatever it is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you begin to be able to dominate nature and kind of live above nature. It's just extraordinarily helpful to have this tool. I am.
Yeah, I think that the idea that deception as being part of it, right, where you're able to strategize and accumulate power, like if we're talking about the fact that humans appear and then they, in short order, dominate all of the hominid species that are on the earth, when this...
Or dominate the niches.
Like when this awareness emerges.
Niches. Niche, I don't know.
Say it again?
They dominate some niche, right? They don't necessarily have to dominate each other, but their ability to plan and make use of the resources better than their
there's other
competitors.
hominids around.
That's what I'm saying.
Right, so they do actually lead to the extinction of the other hominids.
Well, they don't have to like dominate them with clubs necessarily, but they could just get all of the fish out of the stream better than the other hominids or whatever it happens to be.
But I think that it's like if you view it in kind of a rudimentary geopolitical lens too, like deception is really useful for that because you can tell somebody that you're going to do one thing and then do another and then strategize your way around them. And so like you have dominion over the landscape in a way that nobody else does because you can abstract yourself as being an actor on the landscape and no one else around you can. Like that's insanely powerful.
Come to the dark side.
I mean, it's got some aspects of that, yeah.
So to give an example, there's there have been Homo sapiens in the Americas for a long time. So the oldest uncontroversial evidence is White Sands National Park. I believe it's 22 or 23,000 years ago. So we have footprints. But there is not so much as a bead until 13,000 years ago. And so what I think happened is we'll explain the snake cult later, but I think that the snake cult people came into the Americas and just totally dominated. And that doesn't have to be they wiped everybody out, but just their culture completely absorbed whatever was there before. And then after 13,000 years ago, so you see art all over starting then, and you see much more advanced stone tools, and also all of the large prey start going extinct. So the Pleistocene megafauna like the sloth and the mammoth, they just hunt those to extinction. And there was also climate change and other things, but it's quite telling that once this new population gets there, that we start finding way more evidence. There's the population of numbers just went up a ton, and then also their main sources of food go extinct. And so they were just so much better at extracting resource from the environment once they had language, once they had, they started building more complex societies. Of course, think of how you discover religion, right? So you discover that there's a spirit world, and then you discover religion, and that's an extremely powerful cultural tool. And so you can imagine somebody coming in with all of that, just completely reshaping the land. And I think that was the story of the last 50,000 years on every single continent, was just getting gene culture interaction going back and forth, how slowly we start to get ideas, recursive ideas, and then those get baked into culture. And then only the people that can use recursion can access that culture, and those people have more babies. And then that's how you get today where everybody has recursive self-awareness.
Okay, so 23,000 years ago, humans are in New Mexico, but they are basically artifactless versions of what we have today, right? They're not wearing shoes. There's no beads. There's no like art products, as far as we can tell.
Even the stone tools they produce are extremely primitive. Like they look like something that would have been produced like 2 million years ago. Extremely primitive.
And so, where is this recursion being born? Do you think that we can find a place where it emerges for the first time? Do you think that it's kind of coming up everywhere all at once due to some kind of like morphic resonance around the entire planet? Like, how does that start to figure in?
So the classical answer is Eurasia about 40,000 years ago. There were certainly, so it's more complicated than that. There's a lot of places in the world. There were certainly improvements, or there was certainly progress being made on recursion. But I suppose the line I'm most interested in is that 30,000 years of Venus statues from 40,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. And those are from Spain out to Siberia. Those are made at various times and places. And so what I think, and this is actually not just my idea. So there's I had on my podcast, I had Dr. Tom Frosey, and he's the editor-in-chief of Adaptive Behavior, I believe. And he wrote a hypothesis. It's called the ritualized mind alteration hypothesis. And he thinks that in the Upper Paleolithic, the start of the magnificent cave art that we see was shamanic rituals where they were essentially trying to teach subject-object separation. So that's kind of his way of saying recursion, or we're saying the same thing. When he says subject-object separation is the same thing as when I say I am a recursion. And so he thinks that in Eurasia that they developed these methods to teach subject-object separation. He thinks through the use of psilocybin mushrooms. But it could have been many things. So it could have been meditation. It could have been fasting. It could have been dancing. Probably death and rebirth was involved. And pretty close to real death. I mean, many of these rituals they try and take you to the edge of death. And so where were we going with this?
I mean, the subject-object thing is interesting. I wanted to like catch people up. So that's just the idea that there's two pieces of an abstraction, essentially. Like there's two actors in every story. There has to be something that's happening to something. Is that a reasonable way of looking at it?
No, it's more like think of when you're in a flow state. And that's how animals are all of the time. And then your ability to come out of a flow state and think introspectively and experience things not in the flow state, that is subject-object separation.
Isn't that just the production of a story?
Having a subject at all.
Say that again.
It's just the production of a story for what's happening. Like it's an abstraction layer on top of the actual physical events.
I think that what Andrew's saying is he's using subject-object not in the grammatical term.
I see.
He's using it in the term of, as far as I can tell, kind of like a philosophical state, where when you're in the flow state, you are subject to, is this correct? Like inside the flow state, you are subject, and outside the flow state, you are object?
No, so in the flow
Okay,
state, there would be no subject.
Okay.
In the flow state. So like think of do you think animals have an ego?
The ego as being this thing that mediates between desires and expectations of how you should behave inside of a society?
Yeah.
God, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that maybe ego is what mediates the dog's ability to sit when you tell it to sit. Right? Because it's like its instinct is to like go for the food. Its recognition of the superego condition is that like there is an expectation that its master wants it to do something. And the ego is the mechanism by which the dog is able to say, I will quell the desire for food and marry it to my desire, my need to do what the master tells me to do. I don't think anybody else.
Using the dog here. We taught our cat how to do this. So I'm very proud of the cat. We'll sit before we feed her now. I've been really.
Do you think a dog has self-reflection?
She's a cat.
The cat. Look,
or a cat.
You can't ask me these questions because I won't give you the answer that most other people will give you. And so, like, if you want me to answer, like, do you think that most people think that? I can say, obviously, most people think that they don't. But I have the rabbit hole of how poorly we have parameterized animal awareness in our society, for me, is so deep that, like, we should stay on the surface of, like, I know that most people would say no. And so let's just...
Yeah. So, well, actually, that's one of the people. Sometimes I get people angry in my comments who are like, no, animals are self-aware. So that's one of the, we could say, weaknesses of the theory, or one of the things that people dislike about the theory.
I don't think it undermines it, because I'm like, I think that she is self-aware. I don't think that she is self-aware enough to beat my cat, to be able to, like, accomplish... writing a novel, or building a tree house, or
planning what she's going to do tomorrow, you know.
Or thinking about death, right? Like, I'm like, there's some rudiments of self-awareness there, which I think are necessary for her functionality, but it's some far simplified version to what it is that we're talking about in humans. And so I don't think that it damages the model whatsoever, because I'd love to meet the person who's like, no, it definitely is as complex as a human.
Yeah. So Tom Verhulst, so his model and why he's interested in the cave art in the Upper Paleolithic is because he thinks that there were like extremely painful rituals going on where they would get high and maybe experience very close to death, and then in that process, they would learn that they're not just their body, essentially. So that is the realization you want one of these people to have in these rituals. And so he's a well-respected researcher. And that's
Is that what he
around
called,
other
like,
places.
who's the subject object here? Because I think that, so we originally were on this path where we were trying to figure out, like, okay, 23,000 years ago in White Sands, you have hominids that are using tools that are like 2 million years old in design. Where is this idea of recursion starting to appear? Is it everywhere? Is it in one specific place? And then we started talking about Eurasia, and then we got onto this thing of the subject object, and now we're trying to figure out, like, Tom Froese, when he talks about subject object in relation to these rituals, what is subject, what is object? Because I think that Shiloh took it as this, like, almost grammatical part of abstraction, which is that you have a sentence and the sentence has a subject and an object.
Well, we actually just had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. We released it with a linguist, and a huge central pillar of that conversation was the relationship between thought and language, and like whether they could even be disassembled from one another at all. So when he's talking about grammatical structures, he's also talking about structures of thought at the same time. And so that's what I thought you were referring to, but nope.
Yeah, let's like, what is this subject object thing in context of the near-death ritual and flow states? Like, you just put a lot of things on the table, and I'm like trying to, like, map the connections between them.
I thought I was saying just the exact same thing as realizing I am. So like being able to step back, introspect, all of that. So not being always just in the moment.
Okay, so it's similar to this idea of being the main character, being the actor, as opposed to being, because, okay, so to connect a bunch of different things, Shiloh has this really, I love this idea that you always bring up about the ancient gods of the Greek pantheon, which is that, like, these people didn't think that there was, you know, the god of rage and the god of love, and they were, like, real disembodied people. It was a process by which they named the emotions that moved through us in this kind of storytelling and abstract sense in order to be able to create a cohesive mythology that allowed them to interpret their own actions. And
it's just a Jungian approach to it.
Or
there's
James.
these art,
So,
or
yeah,
James,
James is
100%. And this
We'll
idea
come
that
back.
there's
Let's put a
certain
pin-
pieces, there's certain pieces of knowledge that you have without having to be taught them, and those are archetypical in the sense, like, you don't need someone to explain to you how to get pissed off or how to have lust or something like that. They sort of come preloaded.
But there is a moment where they come preloaded and you are fully subject to them. And then there's the moment where they come preloaded and you are now able to distance yourself from it and be like, I don't have to experience the thing that is washing over me right now. I don't have to embody that thing. And I think that this is the subject object, the awakening, the awareness, the difference between the animal and the human, where it's like...
And I would say that all myths flow downstream from negotiating that boundary.
Ooh. And I think that that's also what Andrew's kind of pointing to. He's like, not only do all myths do that, but the foundational myths of all cultures seem to point to the moment where we first learned to do this.
Yes, 100%. So
Okay.
and I can bring this back to Eurasia. Let's say that they had some rituals in the Upper Paleolithic in Europe that were playing with these ideas of self, and they could have been experiencing near-death, like producing near-death experiences, or mushrooms, or whatever. Then imagine somebody gets bit by a snake, and they have quite a similar experience. And I think that something like that happened, and that snake venom was an extremely useful entheogen or drug to accomplish this. So that's like that's maybe the main new claim that I've come up with and popularized to some extent.
There's also
Although
this.
even
There's also this other pillar too, which is the matriarchal origins of self-consciousness. I wonder if it doesn't make sense to talk about that first before the transmission of it.
Well, let's. I think that right now we're like frame setting. We're trying to get all the pieces on the table. So we do have the snake cult. We have this like matriarchal transmission. We have ritualistic near-death experiences that are helping us map the separation between whatever is in the mind and the body. Like, are there other moving pieces of this, or are those kind of the three that we need to tell the full story?
Can you say those three again? That's
Go for it.
I mean, I see the main two as being the matriarchal origins of self-awareness and the use of entheogens, in your case, the snake venom, as a mode of transmitting the knowledge of self-awareness in a very empirical fashion.
But we
Yes.
also, I think, can't get away from the fact that these hominids are doing these ceremonies in the first place. Like that, because I think that that's like another pillar, which is like, okay, so before you even get bitten by this, because your theory is like they're doing these ceremonies where they're learning to define subject versus object. They're learning to define I am, and then the snake comes, and it suddenly is like a shortcut to being able to achieve that. But I'm like, something crazy happened that they even began doing those ceremonies, right? Like, I don't see chimps getting together and like.
Elephants
so
have
I'm
funerals,
not
right?
making strong claims about when snake was involved, all of that. I mean, maybe they were doing it from 40,000 years ago. But I think that the evidence points to that there was a strong, like a tightly packaged snake cult memeplex about 15,000 years ago. So that's that's what I will argue. Who knows how long snake venom had been used, or even how long death and rebirth had been a big part. It does seem like the symbolic revolution starts in earnest about 40,000 years ago. And so there's how long do you think language would have taken to evolve?
It just depends how you define it, I suppose. Ultimately, it's like
How
I
about
say, I see
recursive language?
Well, recursion, yeah, I mean that's it's a mystery. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to understand here. Is like, are there accelerants that allow you to experience that? It seems like this is at the heart of what you're proposing, is that entheogens can accelerate your ability to share this discovery with someone else. So
imagine
if
the
you're able to
first
share it,
person-
yeah, you can do it in an afternoon in a seminar. Just stick a snake on their neck or whatever it is. Like, but if you don't have a way of transmitting that knowledge, then it could take thousands of years for people to kind of come around to it one by one.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I like to think about, imagine the first person who had the thought, I am. So imagine like they just have their mind is blown, and then they try and tell somebody like, hey, there's a soul inside of you, or hey, there's a locus of control inside of you. How would you explain that to someone?
Well, that's the thing. I don't think that you would have the ability to explain. Like, I personally am of the opinion that you can't separate language from thought. Like, I don't think that you can have thoughts. You can have like imagery perhaps, but to abstract it and manipulate those images and so forth, I think that you need thoughts in order to organize those abstractions in a way that's meaningful. And then if you have language, then you've already developed a way to communicate what's happening to you to somebody else.
So I saw a really interesting video of a like house cat and a serval. You know those like really weird looking skinny leopard cats?
Yeah.
And the house cat is being super aggressive and hissing and just trying to start a fight. And the serval is kind of sitting there quietly, and then it raises a paw and puts it on its chest. And then the house cat calms down and the serval puts his paw down, and they kind of like keep looking at each other. And I'm like, okay, well, that seems to be the pre-verbal way that you would communicate, like, get a hold of yourself. And so if you come to the conclusion that you're capable of getting a hold of yourself, then the next level, because that kind of is the sense of I am the actor. I am no longer possessed by the gods. I have an internal locus of control. I am a hold. And so you start probably by teaching others that like they don't have to react that way. And I would imagine that it's relatively slow going because you're working in a cultural background where nobody has a hold of themselves. And so you have to find someone who has that capability that you can reproduce with, and then you have to raise your children, and in the span of doing that, hopefully teach everybody around you a little bit more about taking a hold of yourself. And so it's this very slow, iterative process. But once you have critical mass, I feel like it must happen pretty quickly.
Yeah, so one interesting thing about many of the creation myths is that this dream time or the Garden of Eden, it's also related to morality. It's like the law was set down. And so I had actually never considered that maybe one of the ways they were teaching I am was like calm yourself, like control yourself. But maybe I mean that could have it certainly coincided with you are a person, these are the rules, please follow them, like, or we'll kill you.
Okay, so why do you think that so many of these stories are about ejection from the garden?
So I think that self-awareness like was horrific for a lot of people. So it's I mean, even for a lot of people now, like why do people drink? That you have this whole class of problems that they never had before. So imagine you're in the flow state all of the time, and you are just one with nature, and then eventually, I don't know, you're trying to kill a mammoth, and it pushes you into some rock, and you die. But like I don't know, that's your life. And then, okay, now we need to start lying to get ahead, to conquer our neighbor. So all of this, like it's extremely difficult. There's so that uh, there's an archaeologist I like quite a lot, Jacques Calvin. He wrote about the origins of agriculture, and he thought that Göbekli Tepe was a memory of the Garden of Eden. He thought the same thing about Prometheus being chained to the Caucasus Mountains. I mean, this is so the people associated with like genetically, the people associated with who invented farming from have some components of Caucasus hunter-gatherers before that. And so he thinks that both of those are some memory of a kind of a horrible guilt of I don't know, the pain of being essentially. I also think that the method. Imagine if so I think that a good method to teach this would have been snake venom, or maybe like hook swinging is a very common element of these myths, where you literally put hooks through people's flesh and then raise them on a tree, spin them around until they faint. So I think it would have been like essentially you take some initiate and you crucify them, and that's how you learn what it is to be alive. And so you can I think all of it makes sense in that context. I mean go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that we stumbled into something really important with the observation of being on a hunt and seeing one of your friends die. I think that we see this throughout the animal kingdom as a prototypical, like this primordial realization of the self, whether it's elephant funerals or something much less. Animals do observe death of their comrades in a really peculiar way. Like I remember, yeah, squirrel. I've seen squirrels huddled around a dead squirrel in the middle of the street. Remember that time that there was all those butterflies huddled around that dead butterfly out in the woods? Like you see this behavior, which is it looks very contemplative in a way that the animals may not possess the language to express their identification with what they're seeing, but they are sharing an experience of witnessing death in a way that is hard to not imagine that they are having some sense of self-identity with that person, that creature that's passed away. And even if they walk away and forget about it, for that moment, it seems like there might be a hint of this self-realization, but the inability to transmit it, perhaps using recursive language.
Yeah, I mean, it's so the burial of the dead starts really early in the course of symbolic thought. So I've also seen, and there's so many videos of like animals grouping around one of their fallen, like just walking circles around. It is very, very strange. Um, and it seems like once we got just a modicum of symbolic thought, that the first thing we kind of applied that to was like symbolic funerals. It seems like. Um,
It's perhaps the
but
most
the
disturbing thing that you ever learned too, I think, as far as I can tell. Like, I think most people will have some recollection of talking to their parents about death for the first time and kind of realizing that you're gonna die also. It's this
Yeah.
thing you kind of never get over. It's almost this it's almost the first real wound that we all suffer. You know, maybe you got beat by your parents when you were 2 years old, but for most people, that, as far as like a psychic trauma that we have to endure and wrestle with for the rest of our lives, it kind of starts with that realization.
Or maybe it's the universal realization, right? It's like the one thing that is inescapable. And it's like there's a difference between the animals that gather at the animal funeral and the human that looks at the dead relative and is like, that's coming for me, which is, I think, an instrumental difference where you can feel sorrow for something that's happening in the moment without ever accumulating a sense of the sort of Damocles that hangs over you and everyone that you know and love and that has ever existed. Like, that's a level of existential angst that I think probably is a strong driver towards getting things done. Pardon the interruption. We will get back to Andrew and the snake cult in just a moment. I have to ask you for a small favor. If you like what we do and you wonder about what you can do to support the podcast and maintain a free and independent science media, then come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci. You get to have the moral satisfaction of supporting a project that you really believe in, and you get to join us for our Sunday salons where we get together with some of the most entertaining and interested minds on the internet every Sunday at 10 a.m. and just kind of chat it up and see how the world works. We'd love to see you there, so come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci. For now, back to Andrew.
in the first hour or so, what I've laid out, this is I've tried to lay out a pretty standard view of things, that modern behavior really only starts maybe 70,000 years ago, starts in earnest about 50,000, and is really spotty in the world until about the end of the Ice Age. And it's really bizarre why that is. And then on the what changed and what makes humans special, I've also tried to be just present mostly other people's ideas. So it's really the most standard answer is language and self-awareness. And I definitely have my own take about how recursion ties them both together, but that's also pretty common. Where I do diverge is when I look at world cultures, especially the creation myths. I think that they share a root like 15,000 years in the past. And that I've seen very few other people writing about that. Maybe Joseph Campbell, if you read some of his stuff, he talks about this. But as far as the general audience, most of the people who find my blog are first hearing it when they see me, when they read my stuff.
Can I just add that I think Göbekli Tepe has brought this idea closer to the mainstream consciousness than ever before. Like, we had a conversation with another Andrew Collins, who has looked at Göbekli Tepe. He also brings in the snake, by the way, and notices that this serpent seems to be foundational to a lot of different mythologies and has some diffusional sense of how that might have happened as well. But he has a very different take on what the snake represents. But I think that most people do recognize that the serpent is foundational to the mythological structures of so many cultures, and that when we try to look for the material record of abstract material cultures, Göbekli Tepe is obviously, the closest thing to an organized state or civilization, anything like that we can point at in the area at that time. I don't know much about the South American Monteverde culture, which seems older. There's a number of other candidates, but there's something special about Göbekli Tepe in the West, at least in this Eurasian tradition.
I don't know. How old is Monteverde?
I think they think it's like 30,000 years old. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Let's Google that. Very, 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 very old. Yeah. But I also I think the material remains are few and far between. And I think that's a huge problem in general with looking at the past. Like, we're certainly biased towards the present because material artifacts degrade and disintegrate. Like, if you just leave a piece of like an iron rebar out in my driveway, for how many years is it going to really remain there, even if no humans take it or touch it or do anything with it? Like, things decay naturally. All of our material goods will decay given time. I mean, plastic lasts only 500,000 years, and most of our stuff is made out of plastic. So it's very, very hard. I think this was taken to the extreme by Adam Frank. Who's the other guy who wrote with him?
Gavin Schmidt.
Gavin Schmidt, yeah, they had this Silurian hypothesis. Like, well, just hypothetically, if there was an advanced civilization several millions of years ago, would we have any record of it? And they kind of came up empty. Like, I don't think we'd even see anything. Like, we might see some some rare metal veins in the ground as a result of these people having concentrated certain elements that wouldn't normally be found together, but you're not going to find like a Tesla sitting there or something, right? I mean, this is millions and millions of years. So the record gets degraded really fast, and it's hard to make statements about things, and it's hard to say exactly how fast it degrades too. There's so many factors. So maybe Monteverde had
so
snakes.
Certainly on 2 million years, but on I'd put my money against some like high culture 20,000 years ago that we don't know about, because there is a fairly linear progression. I mean, I'm not saying perfectly linear, but the technological progress kind of makes sense in that from 50 to 40,000 years ago, things get much more complex, and then to 30, 20.
Isn't it crazy though that between 20 and 10,000 years ago in North America, for instance, it's like you have some footprints, and then 10,000 years go by, or 5,000 or 6,000 years before you have anything else. It's like that's thousands of years of people doing stuff.
They have there are dozens of controversial sites that are pre-Clovis. So like Joseph Campbell in his he wrote an Atlas of World Mythology, and he talks, this is back in the 70s, I believe, and he says, oh yeah, that there were people here 40,000 years ago and this was their technology. And so there was a tradition saying, hey, there were people, they just have very primitive technology.
So I was looking up Monteverde, and it looks like Monteverde is thought to have been inhabited 14,000 years ago, but it doesn't have a lot of architecture. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of art or big artifacts. It looks not like a builder civilization the way that Göbekli Tepe is. And so even though it's older, culturally, it's nowhere near as...
That's crazy. I had
complex.
completely pegged it as older than the White Sands. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's like it's really late. And the tools, again, it's like they look like pretty rudimentary. And I just wanted to add, when you were talking about the Silurian hypothesis, you were talking about the decay of plastic, and you said 500. You said 500,000 years for it to degrade.
I said 500 to 1,000. Yeah.
I think that's what I was gonna say. It's like there's a dash in there. I couldn't hear the dash. I was like, the timelines are much shorter than that.
Not very long.
Not very long at all. But I mean, I'm amenable to the idea of there being an advanced culture millions of years ago, but I think that Andrew's right that all of the evidence that I've seen, and I really wish that Graham Hancock's whole thing about, there's this ancient advanced civilization during the Ice Age that we've lost was true. I think that would be a much more interesting narrative for us to stumble into, and it would really
I mean, just to be fair to Graham, like he's walked back a lot on what he means by advanced civilization. Like he doesn't mean laptops and cell phones. And he, at least at this point, that's not really what he's pushing. I think he's just saying an organized structure of people who are engaged in trade and culture and blah, blah, blah.
We watched his like Ancient Apocalypse series, which is I think
I watched the first season, a couple episodes. I've always wanted him to say, like, okay, when did language evolve? Like, so, like, there is, so where, if you believe that humans have been this, like, producing civilization for a long, long time, then, I mean, when did we stop being animals? And so for me, I just say, oh, like, sure, like the last 50,000 years or so are us evolving not to be just animals, and that you can explain all of the weird myths, and you don't have to posit um, some civilization that we don't have any archaeological proof for.
yeah, I think I mean that's just the most parsimonious answer. And I think that the Silurian hypothesis thing was actually about a civilization millions of years ago.
Mhm.
And so for me, I'm like, okay, yeah, it makes perfect sense that you have something that was millions of years ago that's undetectable. And it would be difficult to reconstruct a fairly narrow band of technological advancement before the civilization, let's say, falls apart. Like, let's say we are at the time limit for an advanced civilization, and the production of AI is what eventually drives us to extinction or something. Then our civilization would leave such a narrow mark in the archaeological record that it's entirely possible that we just never would have signs of it. So I'm like, okay, maybe. But prior to the Ice Age, in the near term, I think that the idea of humans evolving language and abstraction and ritual and culture and then diffusing that through the globe is much more compelling. And so we have like what are the pieces that we have on the table in terms of the diffusion? We have this Eurasian culture that is creating some kind of relationship between self and snakes. Do you think that it's a matriarchal culture at this point? Or do you think that that precedes this moment?
I think that at least religiously, it was matriarchal. I don't necessarily make claims about what that would mean about the political organization or whatever. It does seem like if women are more conscious, that they would have more political control. And certainly, if you compare it to the Proto-Indo-Europeans, it seems like they had more political control, because you see pieces of that, say, in uh, say matrilineal lines of let's say, if you're Jewish, it's through the mother's line, and maybe that goes back to some much older tradition. And so people, like when God was a woman, or in the book When God Was a Woman, there's I believe archaeologist Stone. She goes through and finds dozens of examples like this. And so certainly between Proto-Indo-European and before, there's a case for women having more of a role. And she conjectures that goes back to the Paleolithic with the Venus figurines. But I don't have too much to say on that, other than that women invented the rituals, and they also discovered metacognition.
And do you think that Göbekli Tepe is a site where this culture was coalescing and practicing? Or do you think that that's not necessarily related?
Yeah, so I think that it must have been one of the most important nodes. There was, so the group that went into the Americas with an extremely new technological complex, and snake worship being central. So that is a little bit before Göbekli Tepe. And so if you think of the parent culture between Göbekli Tepe and the Native Americans, how that is at least 15,000 years ago in Siberia. I mean, maybe it's 20,000 years ago. And so it's called the Malta Beret culture. and they find there are dozens of Venus figurines there. There's also this incredible carved mammoth ivory that has cobras on one side and then a spiral on the other. And it's interesting because this is Ice Age. It's peak Ice Age, about 22,000 years ago. And there's cobras. Like, why are there cobras in Siberia? It's quite interesting. And this culture, so they're the genetically they're called the ancient North Eurasians, and they go on to populate the New World, and then they also contribute to the people they go through the Caucasus and also contribute to Göbekli Tepe. And so they're also the people who domesticated the dog, and there are domesticated dogs all over the world. So at least some of this culture's inventions made it to the whole world. I think that they were an important node in the snake cult. But yes, I also think Göbekli Tepe was an important node that there's a lot of memories of in Greek myth as well as Christian myth.
Where in Siberia are we talking about?
Right next to Lake Baikal.
Interesting.
So it's Malta Beret culture, I believe.
It's actually where my mom's from.
Which
that's cool.
Which road do we want to go down, the snakes or the women? Because I'm curious about both of them.
I'm curious about both of them, but I'm still trying to, before we go into the snakes and the women, or snakes or the women, I'm trying to understand. So the story of human diffusion is that we leave Africa and then we kind of head out across Asia.
I think then we head back to Africa.
Do we, I guess maybe this is a good place to pause for a second and be like, okay, so if we're talking about this Siberian culture that starts to emerge 20 to 22,000 years ago, where you're starting to see this evidence of snake iconography that you think is diffusing to Göbekli Tepe and then also diffusing into the New World, like, what was their path to getting to Siberia? Like, and
this is,
how
by the way,
did they...
hundreds of thousands of years after anatomically modern Homo sapiens, from what I understand.
Yeah, like, is the world covered in modern humans, and this is just a specific tribe that figures out this specific shamanistic ritual and then disperses it? Or, like, I'm trying to understand their relationship to everybody else.
1,000 years ago, modern humans probably hadn't completely taken over. So there's, in Papua New Guinea, there's introgression from Denisovans that's modeled between 30 and 15,000 years ago. So 15 is still the tail end of when there could have been Denisovans in Papua New Guinea. There's a skull in Africa about 12,000 years ago that's extremely, extremely primitive. So there could have been other archaic lineages still around.
That's wild. I had no idea that it was that recent, that these other species
it's extremely recent.
Wow.
And we also we don't have remains of the humans in the Americas at this time period. So I saw one archaeologist talking about, hey, maybe that was something like Denisovans, Neanderthals. I mean, who knows exactly? That would probably mean they were completely wiped out by the people who came in. Whereas if they were just modern humans who had a more primitive culture, then there could have been more mixing that wouldn't show up as much on the genetic studies now. However, so you're really concerned with this path from out of Africa to like from 40,000 to 15,000. I think so. I'm not as much an expert. I want to talk about why I believe that 15,000 years ago there was some culture that spread everywhere. Because I would also be fine pushing that 15,000. Okay, maybe it's 20,000. Maybe it's farther back. But I introduced.
I'm just trying to set up this idea that if 15 to 20,000 years ago, there is some culture in the Siberian steppes by Lake Baikal that is emerging this psychotechnology, that at the same time, there are people at White Sands that are doing something completely different that are not on this tick whatsoever. There's people in Europe and India and everywhere else that are living their lives, not undergoing this transformative experience.
They're still pleasantly in the flow state.
Yeah, exactly. Is that an accurate vision of this, where there's just some kind of like pulsing node of cultural innovation that's centered on this Rift Valley in the center of Asia, and then everywhere around them, like Shiloh said, it's still like flow state humans.
Yeah, I mean, so don't think too much about the Rift Valley. And so the reason I say that is because that's for the Americas and Eurasia. That's the last common ancestor between those two cultures, and so that's where I get to there. And if you look archaeologically, you have to go back at least 15,000, maybe 20,000. So, for example, the Venus figurines I talk about, as well as the snake, that's 22,000 years ago. And there could have, I assume it was just a process of waves of new ideas being invented, and people, because especially the climate is changing so much in these time periods, there would have been a lot of migrations. But I just think the most recent that this innovation could have been would have been 15,000 years ago or so, and it would have been around there.
Okay, and we're tracing it to that date because you're saying that if we have these cultural fingerprints of the snake in North America, and we also have them in Göbekli Tepe, the logical explanation is that they're not independently arrived at, but that they emerge from a single cultural node that then splits and populates both places.
Yeah.
Okay. So then...
The snake is central to these fingerprints.
Mm-hmm. And so does the diffusion story start here, or is the diffusion story like a different lens on these events for you? Like, now that I have the peoples and roughly their locations and roughly the order of events.
I think that the narrative would make sense to tell it from my first person account. So, I mean, I have a PhD, but it's in electrical engineering. So I studied natural language processing, large language models, and I worked on how the big five personality traits are actually embedded in language models. So they're implied there. And so I wrote about some theoretical connections between personality science and large language models. And then I was writing about, so of the personality structure implied by these language models, it was really weird that reciprocal altruism was the major axis. So in how people talk about one another, the most important, the most prominent factor of assessing somebody's personality, at least in terms of gossip, is do they show reciprocal altruism? And so I was thinking, okay, what could that cause to evolve? And I had this wild idea, like, hey, like, what if that caused us to evolve a conscience? And then what would happen once you have a conscience? What would it be like to first identify with that conscience? And so I have a blog. I was just kind of playing with ideas. And then, so the wild idea I had was, like, why is Genesis such a good metaphor for that moment? Because I was trying to come up with a metaphor for what it would be like to first identify with your conscience. And I was just like, well, it'd be like eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And there are a lot of theoretical reasons from evolutionary psychology, as well as just straight up psychometrics, which I have a lot of background on, to know that women would have made that. They would have made that realization first. And so I was thinking, I read just a little bit of archaeology, and it is surprisingly late that we start acting human. And I was thinking, hey, what if the story of Genesis is a memory of the male perspective of learning that they are an agent? And so that's a It's kind of a weird idea, but I thought, okay, like you first have this idea, like I am the voice in my head, or just more generally, I am. Um, that would have been ritualized. Like if you're trying to explain that, that would have been ritualized. And so I was looking for, so I very quickly thought, um, this is extremely easy to falsify. I can just do something like look at all of the pronouns in all of the different languages across the world, and if they aren't like if they're cognate, then this theory has a chance. But
Yeah, let's unpack some stuff here. I mean, I honestly think we should.
okay, yeah,
We
yeah.
should. I think we should. I'm sorry, might seem dumb, but maybe just also tell people the piece of the story of Genesis that we're all referring to, which is the Garden of Eden. We're assuming
Many
assuming
people
everybody
haven't
knows
read
all.
Genesis. Yeah. And then also cognate.
Yeah, so the story of Genesis. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then there's a series of days where he creates other things. The last being he creates Adam, and then from Adam's rib he creates Eve, and then they live in perfect harmony in the Garden of Eden, where none of the animals eat one another. It says specifically that Adam named all of the animals, and so I don't think that language existed in the Garden of Eden, at least for men, but I think that they had an encyclopedia of words for different animals, because you can have words, like animals have calls. There are monkeys that have different calls for predator from the sky versus from the ground. And I think that humans just must have had an encyclopedic knowledge. And so one of the things that Adam does, he names all of the animals. And then Satan comes in the form of a snake, and he tempts Eve, saying, "Eat this fruit which God has forbidden you to eat." And she says, "Well, in that day I will surely die." And Satan says the technically true thing that no, like you shall not surely die, but you'll become as the gods, knowing good and evil. And so, what I think this is a metaphor for is that the superego or the conscience evolved before the ego. So that there was, in Freudian terms, there was an id. So all of your base desires for, say food or for shelter. And then there was a superego, which is your model of what society wants you to do. And what I think happened is an ego then evolved. So there's this little space between these um, conflicting desires, or these conflicting networks, and that was the moment of kind of humans tearing into this new dimension of the ego, with getting introspection, understanding, hey, I can step back from whether these gods of lust or rage and make a decision for myself. Like you become literally as the gods, knowing good and evil. You become the one that decides your actions.
By the way,
So
does Eve then be like, "Hey, you should try this" to Adam? Is that in the story? I can't remember.
yeah, so then she convinces, so she eats this. So the snake convinces her, she eats it because she wants the knowledge. And the fruit tastes good, and she wants to share it with her husband, Adam. And then, so God comes to the garden, and he says, I forget what it is.
You asked for it, buddy.
No, it's about they realize that God is coming, and so they put on clothes. And God is like, "Why are you wearing clothes?" And they say, "Well, because we're naked." And he says, like, "Who told you that you were naked?" And so there is this, it's the self consciousness is built into the story, that they suddenly have shame. And then, so interestingly, their God says, "Okay, you broke the rule. You get kicked out of the garden." And then he put an angel with a flaming sword between them and this other tree, the tree that had the fruit of eternal life or immortality. And so death comes into the world because of this. So in that day, they do now surely die, or like truthfully die. And then God says, okay, now like hunting gathering was great. Now you're farmers. You're like by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. And so this is it's a whole explanation of why we have to work, where death comes from. It blames first snakes and then women. The crazy thing in all of this is that if you go to where agriculture was first invented, so Upper Mesopotamia, there's Göbekli Tepe, and it is just covered in snakes. Like 50% of all of the animals carved on columns are snakes. So there is, and this precedes, these are the people who invented agriculture. So there literally was a snake cult that pops up right before they invent agriculture. And there is so much evidence that myths can last. This would have had to last 9,000 years, so from about 12,000 years ago till when we get writing. And there's just mountains of evidence that myths can last 9,000 years ago. And it's just incredibly obvious to me that, of course, Göbekli, like, of course, the biggest transition ever would have been recorded, and that we have a version of it in this. I think that Pandora, Prometheus, the Titans killing Dionysus, and us being made from that all of these
Marduk,
different
Slayer of
aspects.
Tiamat. You know, Tiamat's this kind of serpent, like
Yeah.
demon thing too. It's kind of hard to tell exactly, but it seems at the root of that Mesopotamian mythology as well.
Yeah, she was the mother goddess associated with snakes, and she was killed by, I think, Marduk.
Marduk,
Um,
Slayer of Tiamat. Yep.
Yeah. So once again, it's kind of women's fault in all of this. And so anyway, so I had this crazy idea. So I know about Genesis, and I'm like, hey, what if that was an actual memory of the transition? And what if self-awareness was actually pretty late, at least for men? And so crazy idea, but I just start reading the world's creation myths. I mean, well, first what I did is I thought, well, you're going to need a word for I am. So if the idea is I am, you're going to need a word for I am. And so the first person singular pronoun, so I, that should be cognate all around the world. And that was one of the very early articles I wrote.
What does cognate mean? Sorry.
Cognate, so television is a word in English, and then in many other languages like Spanish, television. So that's it comes from the same root.
Got it.
And so there's linguistics. So Afroasiatic is 10,000 or so years old. So Afroasiatic includes a lot of languages in Africa and the Near East, Asia, as you may imagine. And when they say it's a language family, what they mean is that there was some group 10,000 years ago or so, in the case of Afroasiatic, that spoke this. And they can tell because they look at all of the daughter languages, and they have cognates and they have similar grammatical structure. And so I just thought, hey, if Genesis is a memory of humans coming online, then that means that those myths can last that long, which means words like the cognates should also be able to last that long. And so then I looked, and it actually is true. So the ni or na is the first person singular in just many different language families. So pretty much all of like Papua New Guinea, Australia. People can look at my article, the unreasonable effectiveness of pronouns, where I make that case. But so that could be a coincidence, maybe, and you don't necessarily have to interpret that like, oh, pronouns are cognates, therefore Andrew's theory is right. But I mean, science works by falsification, and my first attempt to falsify did not work. And so the next thing I thought, okay, if women invented or discovered self-awareness, it would have been ritualized. And so then I went looking for a ritual, which is, and there's a lot of constraints this ritual has to be. It has to be the beginnings of civilization. It has to be associated with the beginning of civilization. It has to be invented by women. It has to involve something where the initiate might learn something like I am. And so there's a lot of constraints even going into this that I'm looking for. And so I eventually found that all around the world, there are these mystery cults that use the bull roar. And in Africa, Australia, the Amazon, they say that this bull roar it's a very simple musical instrument. It's a slat of wood that they tie to a string, and then they spin around their head. It makes kind of a whirling sound. And this is said to be the voice of God in mystery cults all around the world. And not only that, it's involved in this whole death and rebirth sequence, which is oftentimes extremely painful. And all over the world, they say, oh yeah, women invented this, but now it belongs to men. So it was death penalty for women to see the bull roar in Africa, in Australia, and in the Amazon. This is recorded in dozens of different cultures. It is such a bizarre sequence of events. And so, I don't know, basically this is ignored, is the modern interpretation. It's because there's very few explanations other than actually this spread from a common core. And so that's anyway, for my I was making predictions, and it really seems like there was some sort of cult that spread, which I think was related to self-awareness.
And women as well, right? Because the women
Yes.
can't be part of the exclusion of women too at the point of this bull roar tradition, which is really interesting. I mean, I want to just say it again. I know what we were talking before we started recording, but I came into this with an interest because I noticed that the Judeo-Christian tradition seems to be really devoid of female deities and really just female role models. Like I love the mythology of the Bible and so forth, but it's a hard thing to get women excited about. Just my experience talking with friends who are women, because there isn't that same self-identity. And so I started looking into it. And if you follow the Judeo-Christian tradition back to the ancient Hebrews, you see that they're a sect that comes out of Canaan, and that their central deity, this Yahweh character, comes from a Phoenician or a Canaanite deity that originally has a consort, a partner, a female partner, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you push back, you actually see the removal of female deities. And then if you keep going all the way back, like you can go through Manoah and find something kind of interesting there with, flavors of matriarchal leadership, perhaps. But then you keep going back and you just see all of these totems, right? Like the Venus figures that you're talking about. These are some of the earliest features, material artifacts that we have representing abstraction and religion in these Proto-Indo-European traditions that eventually come to dominate the West. And so there's this stepwise removal, just working backwards for me from the present, where the Judeo-Christian tradition is still very strong and proud in the West, at least in many circles. Certainly, a lot of our morality is informed by it and so forth, or at least encapsulated in it. But it's evolved in this really particular way that minimizes the matriarchal contribution to it. And so it wasn't always that way. And so the question becomes, what was it like at that point? Which is where it converged, which is where my interest in this converged with the theory that you're presenting, which is a story of how women function in that society. And then the question, so the gap between your theory and my interest in this before I even met you is how is it lost? Like, why did women lose that role in religion? I don't know if you have thought about that at all, but that's kind of where the rubber meets the road up to the present, as far as I can tell. Because if women were so important to the production and transmission of this knowledge of the self, how did that get forgotten to the point that women aren't even really, central heroes in the biblical narratives?
The so there were what you're describing as a model put forth by various people in feminist archaeology, like Gimbutas or Stone, with the "When God Was a Woman," and that was really popular in the 70s or 80s. It became less popular. So and they were at least Stone, not so much Gimbutas, but Stone and many of the others. Were mostly interested in the political aspects, so kind of the frame you gave it, and they as well were never able to answer, like, why did men take over? So partly the answer is not good for the feminist cause. So the answer is, as society got more complex and men were fully conscious, that men just dominated. That was kind of a stable equilibrium in places as far removed as Africa, Australia, the Amazon, and the Near East. So this is not just a Indo-European thing. This is everywhere. And so if your standpoint is feminist, then the same, and you think that there was a primordial matriarchy, why does it always end up at patriarchy? I think that there's probably some like game theoretical reasons, whatever, and then after there's enough evolution and selection and like societal complexity that is what happens.
I think
But
there's
I'm
maybe
not getting involved in the is ought, and that's
there might be
where
a
I
less,
think that
there
the
might be
feminists-
a more, it might be a way to protect the feminist vision in some sense, which you hint at in your article, from what I recall, which is that women actually do have a lot of power in these societies that we, or feminists, would call patriarchal, in that they might not have the physical strength, but they do have the ability to manipulate outcomes at a social level that men are sort of infantile at in comparison. You mentioned gossip, right, in your article? Like you examine gossip around this subject matter.
Yeah. So is your claim essentially that in Proto-Indo-European or
Just up to the
let's say
present,
Greek
actually.
culture, that
I'm kind of like working backwards from what I know, which is like the world that I live in. That's like the easiest one for me to make a starting point of. And so the question becomes like, are women less powerful, or is from a political? We reason we're the political structure. So powers is generally the political currency, and so the question becomes: are women actually less powerful in today's patriarchy, or not, or is their power just more subtle than the men's power?
I mean, I think female power nowadays is underrated for precisely the reason that you said. But I actually am. So I didn't go looking for this because I wanted to make a feminist point or not. Like I just happen to believe that women would have discovered metacognition. Like I'm not trying to reorganize society one way or the other. And I really do think that was one of so modern feminists do not take feminist archaeology that seriously. So it's bigger in the New Age movement, all of that feminist archaeology. And so modern feminists will be like, no, we can't. Like they say basically, oh, it's pathetic that we have to look at myths of primordial matriarchy. Like we have to construct a made up past in order to like make ourselves feel better about the present. So that's the current line of how feminist archaeology is treated by, I mean, feminist archaeologists now.
I wonder if there's something about the process of giving birth that is this near-death experience that is most often lived through, right? Like if you are run over by a mammoth or something, maybe your likelihood of dying as a consequence of those injuries while on a hunt is much higher than the likelihood of you dying of your injuries in childbirth, because like just mathematically, like most women have to survive childbirth in order to be able to have more than one child. And so it's this most primordial near-death experience. Because if we're talking about this separation of the subject and object as part of ritual being the place where the spirit and the matter of the body separate most clearly, then here you have a gender that's going through this on a regular basis. It's like baked into the cake for them. And like, let's be honest, being able to make a baby is kind of mythologically powerful. Like,
Yeah, come on. That seems to me to like before I thought about any of this, I'm like, well, obviously people worship women because they make people. Like, hello, that's like, can you do that? I can't do that. So it would make sense that you would be like, these people are super important and we should listen to them.
And it's and to extend that a little bit, it would be pretty transparently like it seems relatively straightforward that once you have come up with the sufficiently complex structures that you need to make a society. Like if I think about, okay, so you're tossed out of the Garden of Eden. Now you have to farm for your subsistence. Now you have grain stores. Now your grain stores allow you to raise an army. And now the politics of motherhood are very different because instead of being the genesis of the universe with each birth, it's now that you are roped into this massive system where you have a role. And your role is to produce the children that are then going to plow the fields and that are then going to go into the army and do whatever actuarial things you need to do. And so maybe it's not necessarily like the emergence of a quote-unquote patriarchy, but more that there's something about the structure of civilization or the structure of these empires that is masculine in its ordering, where it's like everybody has a role, right? And the role is granted to you in accordance with your physical or mental ability. Like we take the strongest to go to the army, we take the hardest workers and we put them to work in the fields, we take the smartest people and they're the priests. And now there's this spot that we have to put people into, which is to produce the foundation of the pyramid. And there's only one type of person who can do that, and that's women.
But by the way, can I just add that almost every single military battle, not all, but almost all of them up to the modern period are decided by sheer numbers. It's like, you got more people than we do, you're going to probably win this battle.
Yeah, and so it's like it becomes, if you take this like crystalline order to be a masculine tendency, and the more like spiritual, free-form, vision quest, like moral birth of human relation to the animal and to nature to be this diffuse, and I don't want to say diffuse, this like more chaotic aspect is the feminine, then it makes perfect sense that as you crystallize humans into a machine that is meant to function in a certain way, that you would erode the power of that chaos. Because you can't have chaos inside of a society. It doesn't work. And like Shiloh said, you need to have strength in numbers. And so, okay, well, once you have civilization that depends on numbers to survive and to thrive, then I think that there might be no other place to put women. And in order to ensure that that happens, you have to slowly erode their presence in the mythology, because it becomes harder and harder to justify this metaphysics of this being the role of woman in society if you have all of these stories where she's like, well, you're the creator of the world and you're divine and you're the one who carried this knowledge to us in the first place. Like, it's myths are like these stories are only as useful as what they let you do, and the stories that survive the longest are the ones that allow you to keep doing the thing that you think is necessary to be doing. And so this is like totally unrelated, but I think that we're living, if technology doesn't fall apart, I think that we are actually living through a moment where we're desperately trying to like rewrite the myths in some way that allows us to like aim towards the future. I think that this is what a lot of sci-fi is. I think that this is
I mean, I think the Matrix is an interesting update to the Garden of Eden story in a way, as a central mythos. Like, I don't hear any other mythology quoted in the modern era as much as the Matrix, and you still have this red pill, blue pill thing. Like, it's kind of like the tree of knowledge and so forth, right? It's almost a reframing of that idea based on the modern technological paradigm that we find ourselves in, where we're maybe facing another similar choice.
Yeah. So one of the things that excites me most about this whole theory, so what is most impactful is that people really do need myths. Like there's not a single culture ever that doesn't have a creation story that says what makes humans special, how did we get it. We just don't have that right now. What I think would be very cool, and I didn't go out to prove this, but what happens to be cool about my theory is it's the same myth. Like it's literally that the Garden of Eden happened somewhat literally. There was actually a snake cult where you would learn about self-awareness, and that is what makes us human. And we have thousands of years of knitting that story into our culture that we've kind of thrown away. And I'm saying, like, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. One other thing on so why did men why patriarchy? So we should talk about the Neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck. So I'm interested in ways to falsify this theory, like bring it into contact with biology, the real world. One of them is the Neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck, and what Neolithic means, that means new rock. So that's from about 12,000 years ago when they started making new types of stone tools. And in that time period, there was a Y chromosome bottleneck. Now, what they do is they model the Y chromosome diversity through time. So they think how many of all of the Europeans that live today, how many grandfathers did they have, great grandfathers, on so on and so forth. And the amount of grandfathers that correspond with about 6,000 years ago, there's just an absolute collapse. And you can do the same thing on the matrilineal side with mitochondrial DNA. And so they compare the diversity between the implied diversity on the matrilineal versus patrilineal sides. And there's a moment about 6,000 years ago, all across the world, where the diversity is 17 times as high on the female side as the male side. So that means is that like 95% of male lineages just went extinct. And so it's not just a bottleneck. So the effect starts about 20,000 years ago. So I think this is a way to falsify my theory, or just theories of recent evolution in general, is that currently the best idea published in Nature to explain this is cultural hitchhiking. Basically, the idea that a band of brothers is going to hoard all of the women. And so basically, this idea spread all over the world about 8,000 years ago. So what I don't like is that first off, that paper is just, they do simulations. They don't even bother. So they think that this idea spread. They don't look for anything in the archaeological record. And I think if they did, they would have found bull roar cults. But they don't even bother. It's a computer scientist that does it. They don't bother trying to tie that argument of diffusion to the real world. They also, if you believe that there is diffusion of the men should hoard women, okay, why did it stop right when we got Bronze Age and we have all of these records? Like it stops really abruptly about 4,000 years ago. What's one more thing anyway, so I don't like that explanation. We're going to find out if eventually we'll find out if the bottleneck had to do with selection, and if it does have to do with selection, then we need to find some theory of like what was the selection for. I think it was for theory of mind. So I think that we introduced metacognition, and men were more schizophrenic. There was imagine if there was a 5%, like a 0.05 correlation between schizophrenia and Y chromosome lineage, then over a couple thousand years ago, you're going to see most of the lineages die out.
You said something really interesting a little while ago about women being more suited to this realization of self. And I'm curious why you think that. I don't disagree. I've been completely obsessed with the differences between my experiences with groups of men versus my experiences with groups of men when you bring a woman into the room. That is a profoundly different situation. And so I do think that there's subcultures going on probably through all of time. And I'm curious why you think women were particularly suited to this. Because I understand why the women would want to transmit that to men. But what makes women particularly suited to that?
I mean, so you can imagine, women are much better at social processing because that was their skill. Even let's go back 100,000 years, even before you have a recursive loop on top of anything, and then they just evolved to model other people's behavior much better. And then so once
what's some evidence of that?
I'm trying to think, going back 100,000 years. So it's not having as much as upper body strength, that they basically that they don't engage in explicit fighting, that any of their fighting is going to be social. And then so if your weapons are social, then you have to really model. I don't know, just personally, sometimes I talk to women and I just know that there's like so many levels to this conversation. That's we're like,
no, it's true. It's true.
I don't have like,
it's 100% true. I understand you run into all of these political constraints. Like we don't, it's very difficult to talk about these issues without ranking values as you go into it. Like you get into these values discussions, which ultimately constrain people's speech, I think, because they don't want to step on toes. But yeah, 100%. Like my experience being married has been incredibly profound in terms of how I understand social interactions with people. Like
Is this why you call me a witch all the time?
I would never do that. I would never do that.
Yeah, so it's not. I mean, I had this theory after I got married, not at all an accident. So it was definitely just kind of like thinking about things. Like, okay, who would? It fits with the I had read stuff on self-domestication, so the survival of the friendliest, and it's just like who was doing the self-domestication. It was just obvious to me that women would have done the self-domestication, that men would have been lagging on that.
Well, it's interesting too, because you can only go so far if you're constantly at war. If you have a tribe and everybody's constantly fighting, whether it's over resources or over women or I guess those are kind of technically the same thing. If people are constantly fighting over things, you can't get to the next level because it's impossible to build something that doesn't just get torn down. And so a society that emerges with the sense of like, hey, let's get a hold of ourselves and focus on the thing that we're really trying to do, which is not fighting, like that would be a society that would be able to move forward, or at the very least be like, okay, well, we don't fight amongst those guys.
Yeah,
I was gonna say.
I think that there's something expansionist about this entire story.
It's like instead of taking Billy's stuff next door, we're gonna recruit Billy and we're gonna go to the next valley over and we're gonna take all their stuff because that's a different family and that's a better idea. And then we get, slaves and loot.
Well, what's crazy is the chimps do that too, to some extent, right?
I think that the chimp societies, from what I've seen, are more violent internally. Like it seems like you don't have the ability to mediate internal conflict. And so in competition for who's the dominant silverback, other younger chimps are constantly trying to rise to the challenge of that, and so there doesn't.
But the whole group is raiding neighboring parties as well.
They are, but I think that there's an ingredient of difference here, which is that the innovation that I'm saying for humans is that the humans figured out how to be like, okay, well, we're going to raid the other party, but we're going to try to minimize the amount of internal conflict that we have, because that's what's going to allow us to actually act together and be able to trust that the person that you're relying on isn't going to screw you over on the raid or whatever. Because I think that it would be relatively easy if you are like in a chimp raiding party and there's one of the chimps that knows that he wants to challenge the silverback to like set up circumstances to make that a possible challenge.
I'm just constantly struck when I'm reading the anthologies and the lists of different kings and groups, like in ancient Sumeria and Elam, how much internal backstabbing occurs and how much fratricide and maneuvering in this internally violent capacity is occurring. And that might be very far downstream of this moment that we're talking about.
I think it is. And I think that this is the, like, I have an instinct that in a world that is dominated by women, that there might be less overt violence. Like, I don't know if that reads...
certainly.
That just seems intuitively true to me. And so by the time that you've pushed women out to the margins, they don't have enough of a voice to be like, hey, why don't we deal with this in like any other way except for this? And so
unless it was like a tribe of like Hillary Clintons and Margaret Thatchers or something like that.
I mean, you know my opinion about that.
But they might have been folded back into the patriarchal incentive structure.
Yeah, I think that when you have a strong incentive structure because like I don't think that the genders necessarily are that there's like a forced conformation to matriarchy or patriarchy. Like I think that you can have males that fall into like a matriarchal bent, and you can have women that fall into a patriarchal bent. Like I think that these are archetypes that we embody and are not necessarily like gendered in this way where, okay, if you're born in this body, this is the only thing that you can inhabit. And so there's plenty of like female warhawks in the modern day, but I think that urge emerges from the structure of like this warring tribes mentality as opposed to cooperating.
It's also soft power.
I mean, yeah, Artemis, the goddess of war, right? But I want to talk about snakes.
Let's do snakes.
Isn't Artemis like the goddess? Oh, wait a second. Is she the goddess of war?
Or the hunter. She's the hunter.
The hunter. That's it. Yeah. She kind of wrangles nature.
Checks out. I mean, like in terms of like the role of the woman and birth and propagation of lineages. But so let's do snakes. So we have this we have this idea that there is something that women figure out, that they are able to identify an internal locus of control. They're eventually able to transmit it to others. There's also this overlapping selection event that's happening, which is, the Y chromosome bottleneck. There's also this mitochondrial bottleneck. So clearly there's like multiple things that are layering on top of each other to create a really powerful shift in the way that modern culture looks versus everything that is before this transition. There's two pieces that we haven't fully wrapped, one of which is the snakes, and the other one of which is, I want to get back to the bull roarer, because you place it in this position of central importance, but I think that we can get there after we do the snakes. So let's do the snakes.
Yeah, so quite early, I mean, after I associated Genesis with some moment of self-awareness, a memory, I was like, well, I should just, if it's the human story, it has to be universal. So it can't be just going back 12,000 years ago to the Near East. It has to go back quite a long ways. And actually, it turns out just like 15,000 years. So once you get to 12,000, 15,000, not too much farther. However, I just start reading creation myths, and it's not subtle that snakes are everywhere. It's just all over the place. There are snakes, and some of them extremely similar to Genesis. So the Chinese one really leapt out at me. So it was, the first couple is Nuwa and Fuxi, and then they're always shown as two intertwined snakes. Their body is, and that's the first couple. Then you have, I mean, Quetzalcoatl. You have the rainbow serpent. You have all over. And so, I mean, I knew about the stone date theory. It's like, can you get high on snake venom? And you 100% can. So I thought, like, what if they were using this as like an active ingredient? And then all we have are these, like, there actually was a snake in the garden. And so then I started looking. The next thought I had, like, if it's ritualized, there is an anti-venom. So you're not just going to have people get bit. And then in all of these stories, very closely related are snake antivenoms. So it's the fruit is often said to be an apple in the Garden of Eden, and apples are a very good source of rutin, which is a potent antivenom. You can do the same thing. So the lotus flower, so lotus and snakes, very strongly associated. I knew in Egypt and in India, both also related to the creation myth. And lotus also is a great source of rutin. You can do this with, so Dionysus, he has a scepter of fennel, which is another good source of rutin. So I just maybe. And then
Is
I
that an
started
antivenom
reading.
against? Is it against a particular snake, or is that just a
I
generalized
think it's
antivenom? How potent
elapid
is it?
by
Yeah.
elapids. So like the cobras and such. And so amazingly, I am not the first person to come up with this idea. So the book, the classic, When God Was a Woman, somebody just a couple weeks ago. So this is years after it's been like 2 years since I've written this. A couple weeks ago, somebody pointed out to me that in When God Was a Woman, Stone spends like 3 pages guessing that the original matriarchal cult, that they use snake venom as a hallucinogen. So it's interesting that kind of multiple people come to this idea. There's also there's a bunch of classicists who have written about this, that there's a lot of evidence that the mystery cults around the Mediterranean, so like the mystery cult of Dionysus and Eleusis and Isis, that these
Asclepius?
were what?
Asclepius as well, the symbol of modern
Uh,
medicine.
yeah, the symbol of modern medicine. There's this so the Turkish and Armenian story of where medicine comes from is there's this boy who got bit by a serpent, and it enlightened him. He got bit on the tongue by the king of the snakes, and it enlightened him, and that's where medicine comes from. So also quite similar to Asclepius, and it's weird that it has to do with actually the bite. And then also I did research on, okay, do people still get high with snake venom? And they totally do. Like, you can, in India, they have snake dens, which are like opium dens, but you pay for snake venom. They sell it at raves. It's a dissociative, which is exactly what you want for the subject-object separation. It's also an extremely good source of nerve growth factor. So in helping with brain plasticity, all of this extremely surprising. I think they were doing lots of things. Somebody got bit by a snake, and they ritualized this.
Can you tell us a bit more about the present usage of this? Like, what kind of experiences are people inducing? Have you been bit by it? Have you done this? Are you gonna do it?
That's part of your research.
No. There's a few papers. Most of this is in India of modern usage. Most of it is in India. That's also where there's an Indian, a famous YouTuber who got put in jail in last year for selling snakes, the crate and cobra, naja naja.
Wait, like selling them like on YouTube and like the YouTube shelf, or
No,
just like people could write in and
at
he
a
would send
rave.
them
He
like,
was selling them at a rave.
and so he was
And so this
selling
was
live
there's like a bunch of
snakes.
Bollywood stars implicated. Anyways, it was
Wait, so like just to be clear, like he's selling live snakes.
yeah, and there's actual footage of some guru or somebody have applying this to somebody's tongue, like a cobra to somebody's tongue. That is apparently a place that people like to take the venom. Apparently, they'll start out with on like their foot or something, but when they really want, after they're chasing the dragon, as it were, they go for the tongue.
That's wild. So what's the trip report? Did you come across any trip reports for the experience? Because you can find tons of stuff on Erowid about, this is what DMT felt like. This is what this like
Nothing on
exotic
Erowid,
cannabinoid. Interesting.
There was a couple of in like the vast tomes of Erowid. There were a couple, but nothing that interesting. There's a major guru in India. His name is Sadhguru. He talks about, so there's dozens of YouTube videos where he talks about the effects, and he talks about how it's a dissociative. He's like, snake venom will kill you. It will cause you to live again, but it will kill you. And he's stuff like this, where he's describing it in perfect entheogenic terms, where it's a death and rebirth, dissociation. So it's surprising. So I don't think, my guess is it's not the best drug. Like it's probably not the best hallucinogen, but it's the one that's most likely to find you. So maybe it was the first that humans started experimenting with.
I think you're gonna have to do some primary research here, man.
How
When I set up my snake clinic, we'll do a meetup.
Excellent.
Discounts in the description.
How lethal is a snake bite? I thought that cobra bites were basically end times without antivenom.
Yeah, I mean, one would think, right? So Indra, when he fights like the cosmic serpent, he first takes a drought of something, and so I think that they were they had an anti-venom related to this. Same with, so there's a mystery cult among the Hopi Indians, and they do a snake dance, and this is with a rattlesnake. They dance around with live rattlesnakes, and of course they're getting bit by these because they're dancing around. They have rattlesnakes in their mouth. But the women would prepare this anti-venom, and apparently nobody died. So there's this secret anti-venom that they passed down for ages and ages. I mean, absolutely wild stuff. And
I wonder if there's some.
They used the bull roar.
Who are you going to say?
I wonder if there's some elements of tolerance too, like a Princess Bride kind of story, where they're just ingesting it in small doses to the point that they can handle higher and higher doses of it. I don't know. It just seems easier than an antidote.
There's a classicist who writes about this, who he thinks that Eleusis, that it was basically the priestesses were processing the venom for other people, and that he thinks that people would get high using their breast milk. That's what he thinks. So there's many ways to puff the magic dragon.
There's probably an OnlyFans for that somewhere.
I'm sure.
It is the internet after all. So, all right. People are taking snake hits and awakening into themselves. The idea is kind of that women are the ones that have figured this out first, and so they're the priests of this culture, and they're the ones that are bringing it to others.
So that's a good question. I think it's hard to say for sure how it would have spread. So that it could have been this culture conquering, or it could have been more like a missionary. Like they come. There's a lot of really interesting myths. So there's an identical myth about both Isis and Demeter. So that they have the mystery cults in Egypt and Eleusis, respectively. Eleusis, Greece, and Demeter becomes the nurse to a neighboring culture's prince, and then she is putting him in the fire every night to burn off his mortality. And then the queen comes and finds this out, and she freaks out, and so he doesn't become fully immortal. And so that's kind of a missionary story. And then she also, there's I believe the younger brother she teaches the Eleusinian mysteries to, which were I think a downstream event. So these mystery cults are all downstream of the original snake cult, and they actually was it Domophon, who's the brother who's taught the Eleusinian mysteries. He goes and spreads these across the world in a chariot drawn by serpents. And so there are these elements of like, oh, the mysteries spread via essentially missionary efforts. It could have also been a lot of just wiping out. And it also could be, I mean, who knows when the transition from men to women really happened. It could have been men took charge, and then there is still the myth of the primordial matriarchy, but then they go around conquering a lot of other people. I don't make really strong claims about all of that, but I think originally it was invented by women, and it diffused in many ways, probably often violently.
And so to bring this home, connect this enormous story to the bull roarer.
So we don't know much about the mystery cults around the Mediterranean because they would kill you if you said what happened. I mean, they're a mystery cult. However, the father of Greek tragedy. So Greek tragedy is thought to have come out of these mystery cults. So they were doing various plays in these mystery cults. That you were supposed to experience things in these mystery cults. And then Greek tragedy comes out of this. That's a pretty mainstream idea. The father of Greek tragedy, he was put on trial for profaning the mysteries. He said too much in his plays. And in the Libation Bearers, it talks about essentially that you can read it as venom being mixed with milk and given to initiates. So basically, he revealed their secret sauce. At least that's what the classicist David Hillman argues. Another story that's central to these mystery cults, it revolves a lot around Dionysus and his death and rebirth. So in the Orphic mysteries, the creation story is we come from the ashes of Dionysus. That Dionysus is a child that Zeus had with a woman who is not Hera. And so Hera wants to kill Dionysus. And she gets the Titans, the elder gods, to do this. And as he's a child, they lure him with various toys. So they lure him with a snake, a mirror, an apple, and a bull roar. So all of these things once again. And they tie him up, they tear him apart, and this has to do with the mysteries of Dionysus. Like we have this myth, and then probably the mystery cults were doing something about this. So what's very notable to me, and has been for 150 years, anthropologists have talked about this, is that they were using a bull roar somewhere in this ceremony. And actually, the idea that women invented culture, that goes back to a contemporary of Darwin, a guy by the name of Bachofen. So he was a classicist that read all of these classic Greek texts, and he said it looks like there was a time when women were in charge. So just based off the Greek texts. And so he was big on Hegelian dialectics, and so he thought that before marriage existed, that the only known, like, nobody would have known what a dad is because who knows who the father was. And so the only cultural dyad was the mother-child. And so women invented culture as they're teaching their children. And then so from that, the next part of this Hegelian dialectic was men rising up. And he called that the Dionysian era. So it went from, I think, Aphrodite, whereas this great like mix of love. There's free love because they have no marriage, and then there's the Dionysian era. And he relates it. He thinks that mystery cults were part of the male rising up against this primordial matriarchy, which is an extraordinary thing to say in the 1860s. Because if you fast forward 150 years to now, they actually have found at Göbekli Tepe, they have found a bull roar, which was used ritually. And so there's so much about these mystery cults that relates them to the beginning of agriculture, and just like the story of Adam and Eve, the beginnings of self-awareness, of human cognition. But it's crazy that this instrument that was used in the mystery cults is also found at Göbekli Tepe. And so that's extremely mainstream. So you can read Jacques Calvin on the origins of agriculture. He's a very mainstream archaeologist, where he argues that before even knowing about the Göbekli Tepe existed, he argued that there was some transition in self-awareness and religion that produced the agricultural revolution, and that the mystery cults are a continuous tradition from that moment. And so
and that bull roar diffuses west as well.
Well, the bull roar goes back to 20,000 years ago, is the oldest uncontroversial.
Sorry, west via the east.
Ukraine. And so people like Joseph Campbell write about how shamanism and a bunch of new technologies flowed in this package from Siberia. So Joseph Campbell, he argued this. And so the bull roar cult, it goes back at least 20,000 years, and it's in this same complex. And so it's really interesting because you go back to the 1860s, and this guy, this is before carbon dating, this is before we know so much, it's before the theory of evolution, and he's writing, we think there's a primordial matriarchy, and it was associated with a bull roar mystery cult where men rebelled. And then we find through archaeology, we find there's 30,000 years where there's only images of women from in the with the Venus figurines. And then in a continuous tradition, then we have the bull roar starting with at the very start of the agricultural revolution. And then not only that, it's worldwide. So anthropologists started going to the Amazon and to Australia. So Australia is a very interesting case because the bull roar is all over the continent, and it's associated with rites of passage that are said to have been established during dream time. So kind of their version of the Garden of Eden, like before time, in the before time. And if you go to so the myths are, okay, these in Arnhem Land, so in the north part of Australia, they say, oh, the Jungle Wall sisters, they showed up on canoes, and they brought us language, and they brought us these rituals. And so I think that it was a real event. It was people showed up with the snake cult and the bull roars, and then that spread all across all across Australia. And the same happened in every continent. And you can't really explain. I don't think there's another explanation for Australian archaeology, because you can say, okay, there's the rainbow serpent all over. Where's the root of the rainbow serpent? And the earliest rainbow serpent that they have found is about 7,000 years ago. And so it's just weird. Why is that universal if it's so recent? Like it can't be that they've been worshiping the rainbow serpent for 50,000 years. It probably is more recent. And the myths say somebody came and brought us these ceremonies in the dream time. So I think that's essentially real.
7,000 years ago is really late, though, right? Because we were talking about. I mean, it's okay. trying to fit all of these pieces together because there's this Siberian culture that we were 20,000 years ago starts to produce this kind of cultural complex. Do you think that it takes it 10,000 years to get to Göbekli Tepe? Like, because Göbekli Tepe is about 10,000 years ago, right?
So I'm not exactly sure the route it would have gone to there. I can just say we know that it got somewhere at a certain time period.
Okay, so like Göbekli Tepe is the downstream manifestation of something that's born in Siberia 20,000 years ago.
So I just want to say Siberia is
I'm
the node root. It's not exactly the parent root, but it's the node that has to exist between the new world and old world. And then, so for example, there's a bull roar in Ukraine 20,000 years ago. And there's and there's a continuous tradition of Venus figurines. And so I'm just saying, out of this kind of milieu of the mother goddess religion came this cult, and then that spread, and at some point that spread to Australia. And so 7,000 years ago, that's the oldest known rainbow serpent. But there's others. So it could have been the religion got there earlier. There's just not evidence and stuff like that. But probably in the last 10,000 years or so to Australia.
That's really cool. I mean, that seems almost like bridging the gap to modernity in some ways, because it's like if they're coming 7,000 years ago to bring the legend to Australia, and the same legends are active in Mesopotamia where the like Judeo-Christian traditions are being born, it's just suddenly this massive diffusion of a mimetic frame that seems almost impossible to believe for the world 7,000 years ago, and yet the evidence seems to point to it being the case. Like, that's kind of crazy. It's crazy. Like, you wouldn't expect there to be a legend that 7,000 years ago could just consume the world through this kind of missionary spread.
I think that if you had a way to teach metacognition, there's no way it wouldn't consume the world.
Yeah, like the utility function there is just off the charts, right?
Yeah. And so also, I'll give you another line of evidence. So I'm not saying like, oh, we look at the bull roar and there's a whole cluster of ideas. So one that's kind of interesting is, the seven sisters of the Pleiades. This is a myth in Greek culture. How there's seven sisters of the Pleiades, but one is lost. If you look at the Pleiades, you can only see 6 stars. So the Pleiades are associated with 7 sisters in many, many different cultures. And even more than that, they're associated as being like in conflict with the constellation of Orion, which is male, in many, many cultures. And strangely, there's this accounting error in many cultures where you can only see 6 stars, but there's actually 7 sisters up there. And it's a plot point about the 7 sisters. So this...
By the way, that shifted from my understanding, like from an astronomy perspective, there was a point in time in the past where the alignment of those 2 stars was not in occultation, such that there were actually 7 stars visible at some point, like 50,000 years ago.
50, I think it's more like 100,000. So
sure.
An astronomer. So I've read that paper. So most of the comparative mythologists, they say they take it as a given. They say, oh, well, Australia and sub-Saharan Africa have been hermetically sealed for 50,000 years. So anything shared worldwide has to precede the out of Africa event. It has to go back to our genetic root. And so you read the literature on the 7 sisters of the Pleiades, and they'll be like, oh, well, this myth must be 100,000 years old, 50,000 years old. And it just makes no sense. So they only get there because they assume that Australia has been hermetically sealed. However, there's so much evidence of contact of culture going into Australia and sub-Saharan Africa. It's just like archaeologically, people don't like diffusion because they think it takes away from Australia. That they like their Dreamtime stories are, I mean, essentially stories of Eurasian culture coming and uplifting them. You can see how that wouldn't fly, but they paint themselves into just bizarre stories where for some reason this myth lasted 100,000 years. Like if that's the case, if myths can last 100,000 years, why don't we understand the Sapient paradox better? Why don't we understand Göbekli Tepe better? Like if myths can last that long, then why is it crazy that that the story of the Garden of Eden is a memory of Göbekli Tepe? I just think it's completely inconsistent. So yeah, that's comparative mythologists are good that they get together all of this data and all of these different myths that are similar, but I think that their assumptions going into it are not good.
It's a heck of a theory, man. I love it. I think this is completely fascinating. And obviously, if people want to go deeper into this, you've got a blog and we'll link it down below. And are you thinking about turning it into a book? You kind of hint at that at the end of the blog. Perhaps you could, you had to draw the line somewhere. Are you going to develop this even more, or is there other stuff that you want to work on instead?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see on that. So I've written tens of thousands of words on this, and I think it kind of stands enough that it can be falsified or not. So if the Y chromosome stuff works out, then I think it might merit a book. But right now, I'm pretty busy with other stuff. I haven't been writing on my blog that much.
So, for somebody who is going into the theory and they're going to read your blogs and they're going to start to think about this and they're going to maybe pick up the torch and start to focus on open questions, what do you think are the most important open questions that still remain after all the work that you've done?
I mean, is the Y chromosome bottleneck due to selection? So that's just a very straightforward, answerable question. There's also just in general, what has selection been for in the last 10,000, 20,000 years? Yeah, those are the biggies. I also think so. I've been reading Bernardo Castro, if you're familiar with him.
Mhm.
So he does a lot. So have you had him on the podcast actually?
A
Yeah,
couple
a couple
times.
Oh
times.
yeah. So he's great. So people, I mean, I'm a hobbyist. I picked this up, and I have training in science, so I could frame it as a prediction and go with that. But he actually has training in the metaphysics, and so what interests me is more. So there's Genesis, which is the story of the beginning of our alienation, and then there's the New Testament, which is what to do about that alienation. And I'm really interested in how John begins the gospel. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So I think that there's extremely deep metaphysical stuff there. And so I have articulated my work so that it works complete with a materialist perspective, and I just talk very broadly about the special sauce of being human. So it has something to do with recursion, self-awareness, but I think that there's also something there about like the metaphysics of what would it have been like when you get this recursion looking back at itself. Like something in there seems quite deep, and so I'd love to. Well, basically, I think Kastrup has done a lot of work on interpreting both Genesis and also the story of Christ, and also various Eastern traditions in a metaphysical sense. That probably I wouldn't do, but I would put as an open question of my own theory. So just working it into more, I would say more serious questions. So I hope that the idea becomes popularized enough that some people do kind of pick up the torch and take it from there.
We're actually going to have a gentleman on in a week or two who's asking that exact question about the Gospels, more or less, which is where did this, who wrote, basically, how did this new version of the story come about? What's the significance of the introduction of the Logos and things like that? I think it's going to be pretty powerful because obviously the people who could even write at the time that this was happening was a very small fraction of the people in Rome at the time. And so there's a real interesting mystery story behind the production of the Gospels in the first place. So I'm excited to dig deeper into that. People can look out for it. But otherwise, man, I think it's awesome. I love it. I love the way your mind works. And I've been thinking about these tangential issues for years as well. And I hope we can find more people to bring into the fold. I did want to mention, we recently did a podcast with Andrew Collins, who looks at an alternative perspective on the snake. But even in Andrew's book, he has this illustration of these shamanistic cults at Göbekli Tepe, and they're women who are doing the rituals. He never mentioned it explicitly, but it is, subliminally part of his story at the same time.
Is it Göbekli or Karahan?
Oh, maybe it was Karahan.
I think his latest book's about Karahan.
I'm sorry.
But in Karahan's actually really funny if it is run by women because there's all those like giant phallus statues there, which just puts an entirely different spin on the entire affair.
Yeah.
That's a whole other podcast.
I know.
So there's actually a snake-headed woman carved into Göbekli Tepe. There's I believe maybe just one woman, and she looks extremely similar to the paintings of the Jangawal sisters, who are like this is like 8,000 years ago in the north part of Australia. And the myths related to this are people showed up on canoes. The artistic styles, many archaeologists think that artistic style, it's called X-ray style of art, did diffuse from Eurasia. So I think it was literally the same character. I've written a little bit about that. You can find that on my blog. But I think that there was a great goddess who is displayed in very similar ways all throughout the world.
It is a really cool story. You said that you're not really working on this going forward, though. What are you working on?
I mean, just work stuff in general. So I work in AI. So I work in making satellite images more searchable. So, I mean,
Also
a man,
very important.
yeah, a man's got to eat. So that's what I'm putting most of my time towards right now.
Absolutely. I mean, I hope we get the chance to talk to you again as you're thinking about these things. We're going to keep putting your ideas in front of the, unconventional archaeologists and theorists that we find, because I think that you're onto something that's really, really valuable. And so
maybe even a conventional archaeologist if we can find one that doesn't bore us to tears. Yeah.
Yeah. But I really appreciate you taking the time and laying this all out for us. And I wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's really been great.